a couple different issue areas. You mentioned the mass incarceration. Our focus is more on prolonged solitary confinement, which is holding prisoners in a cell 23 to 24 hours a day, alone, no human contact. And there are people who have been in that for 40, 50 years.
Yeah.
And there have been studies that after 15 days, it psychologically affects your brain in a permanent way. We also work on combating anti-Muslim sentiment. It's kind of a growing program right now, so we're working on various hate ads that are out, kind of just growing that portion. We also do post 9/11 detainee work, releasing the Senate Intelligence Committee's report on torture, which is what we're anxiously awaiting.
I actually talked to Senator Feinstein.
Yes,
I was at dinner
did
with
you?
Senator
Did you really?
Feinstein. And I
Really?
said,
What did she say?
she said, I said, a lot of expectations about this report. This was about 3 weeks ago. She said it's coming out, she said. And this was before 9/11.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah.
this is before, so it wasn't gonna come out before
Before
9/11,
then.
but I expect that she's gonna release, I mean, it's gonna be released. She is
Oh yeah, it's
absolutely.
just a
Oh, I know.
redaction process.
That's the big problem. is
About the
what
redaction.
will
yeah,
be
what's
released?
going to be released. So
How,
murmurs are that it's
not all
either
8,000 pages,
no,
but
no.
the whatever it is, 800 pages, what is it?
It's 6,000
6,000.
pages.
6,000 pages and the.
The summary is
450.
Yeah.
I think she's gonna release that.
That would be great.
She's certainly going to try to
Yeah.
release it. She's our senator.
Right.
And
We're from California.
And I work in California politics, and people who cross Dianne Feinstein
Regret
don't like the result.
No.
And she does not like that she has been crossed on this,
Yeah.
and I think we can be confident that
yeah.
something
Oh,
is
she
going to
was-
be released.
Well, this was a social,
Right.
this was a social, it wasn't the topic,
Yeah.
wasn't.
Right,
it?
exactly.
Yeah.
So,
But-
but I did talk to her,
Yeah.
I said, which I don't often do, but she is a formidable lady.
Yes,
She-
she
oh,
is. Oh, yes.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
I think
Absolutely.
she's a force of nature.
Yep.
You
Good
got
that
it.
she's on the right side, I mean, she is totally.
Yes.
On this one, yes,
On this-
she's quite angry at having been crossed, I
Yeah.
think, and not thrilled at having the CIA investigate their computers either.
Right.
Yeah, that was not great. Well, shall I just,
Yeah, yeah,
okay,
go ahead.
jump in? Okay, so
Why don't you introduce yourself?
my name is Rebecca Gordon, and Ethan was actually going to say a little bit about me.
Do the
He
brief
wants to,
introduction,
that's
certainly.
cool.
So Rebecca Gordon received her MDiv, her Master's of Divinity, and PhD from Graduate Theological Union. Her dissertation in the field of ethics and social theory focuses on the United States' use of torture in the post-9/11 period. She is currently a lecturer at the University of San Francisco. Other interests include political philosophy, theories of justice, including questions of race and gender, and their application in the world. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. So,
Yes.
this book, Mainstreaming Torture, is a book about institutionalized state torture. And I think part of the problem that we've had in this country when we talk about torture is we have a misconception of what it is. We think of it as Jack Bauer saving Los Angeles on 24 by torturing the one individual who absolutely has the information, and if we can just get it out of him, we can save the entire city. This is not how torture works. It's not what torture is. Institutionalized state torture is a socially embedded practice. It's not something you do once and done. It's a practice. It has its own histories, its own institutions, its own traditions, its own rituals of initiation, ways that people are brought into the practice, and I'm going to argue that it also creates within the people who practice it a certain set of moral habits that some people might call virtues or vices. And also, in at least a nominally democratic country like the United States, to the extent that we allow it to happen, it also creates in us certain moral habits that I think are not valuable, that I think are actually pernicious. So, what do I mean by institutionalized state torture? I have a working definition which goes like this. It's the intentional infliction of severe mental or physical suffering by an agent or official of some political entity, which results in dismantling the victim's sensory, psychological, and social worlds with the purpose of establishing or maintaining that political entity's own power. So let's unpack that a little bit. The first part, the intentional infliction of severe mental or physical suffering by an agent or official of a political entity, that comes from the UN Convention Against Torture and other inhumane, cruel, and degrading treatment, which the US has signed. And it's like any treaty, it needs interpretation. And one of the things that happened when the US signed it was we added on a few little reservations. It's sort of like putting a big red asterisk on the convention and saying, well, yes, but by mental suffering we actually mean, and went on to talk about mental suffering as only counting if the effects lasted for years or decades. Now, of course, it's very hard to tell in the moment when you are giving a certain person a kind of treatment what the effects are going to be decades from now. In addition, once the treaty was in effect, we passed what, as every nation that signed the treaty was supposed to do, what's called enabling legislation. In other words, laws that put it into effect. And the US government took the stance that US laws for actions inside the US already outlawed anything that might be called torture. It was already illegal in the US. And so the laws that we passed were only applicable to actions that took place outside US territories. And it's an interesting question whether or not that includes Guantanamo, which is located on Cuban ground, but is in fact leased by the United States for 99 years. Is that US territory or not? We don't know. But in any case, only one person has ever been indicted and charged under this enabling legislation, and that is a son of Charles Taylor, who was charged for torture during the Civil War in Sierra Leone. So it's not a law that gets used or applied to the actions of Americans, at least so far. So, as I say, any law needs interpretation. And when the CIA began their intelligence gathering work, in other words, their torture, they wanted to make sure that they had some kind of legal cover. So they turned to the White House Office of Legal Affairs, and two men wrote a memo for them interpreting the convention so that they could follow it properly. One of them, John Yoo, has just recently earned an endowed chair at the Bolt Hall School of Law at the University of California at Berkeley, so a very prestigious chair. And the other one, Jay Bybee, is now a federal judge. So these folks have not suffered, but they did write for the CIA what is now a famous memo. And in it, what they talked about was how to understand this really difficult language, intentional infliction of severe mental or physical pain. This was just so hard to understand that they had to parse it out. And what they found was that in order to be severe physical pain, the victim's pain would have to be so great that it would ordinarily be associated with sufficiently serious physical condition or injury, such as death, organ failure, or serious impairment of bodily functions. In other words, if the target didn't die, then it probably wasn't torture. Once this memo became public, it was rescinded and replaced with a kinder, gentler memo, but basically the damage was already done. So I said that torture results in dismantling the victim's sensory, psychological, and social worlds. So what does that mean? Here, the really important work has been done by a woman named Elaine Scarry, who wrote a really great book called The Body in Pain. And in it, she talks about how torture essentially is the intentional unmaking of a human being's world. So to begin with, if you've ever experienced terrible physical pain, you know that in that moment, that's all you can pay attention to. It completely monopolizes your attention, and the whole world shrinks down physically to the contours of your own body, because that's all you can notice. And at the same time, your use of language is temporarily disrupted, because all you can do is utter screams, utter the language that indicates I am in pain. And as you know, human beings use language constantly as the way we interact with the world. And so when we are robbed of language, we are robbed of one of the most important ways that we are connected to our own world. Our world is broken. Similarly, torture destroys our sense of time. And in fact, torturers intentionally mess around with people's sense of time, but also in the moment, everything is reduced to this eternal now. And it's as if your future is unimaginable and there is no past, it's just the now. I also said that torture destroys a person's social world. And this is really important because it points to the real purpose of torture. So how does that work? Well, first of all, when you have been picked up by, say, the Treasury Police in El Salvador or the CIA and are being held in a black site somewhere, the first thing that happens is you've been ripped out of your own social context. You no longer have contact with the people who made up your own social world. Then you are forced to reestablish a relationship, and the only people you really have a relationship with are the people who are interrogating you. And so the state kind of takes a member of a social body, a union, a sewing cooperative, a church, a Christian-based community, and remakes that person as an isolated individual whose only relationship is with the representatives of the state. Then, in the context of interrogation, people are made to betray the people that they care about. And so they will give up eventually a name, an address, a place where a safe house is, some little piece of information. And over again, people who've been tortured report that when they do that, they hear, oh, we already knew that. We just wanted to hear you say it. So what's the purpose of that? The point is that you then take that person who has betrayed the people they care about and you put her or him back out on the street. Torture only works if it's not completely secret. It only works if people actually know that it's going on. And so people see, members of a union, members of an organization of any kind, see this person who has been broken deeply. And then the question develops, what did they say? And the suspicion moves through the organization and pulls the organization apart from the inside out. And if you've ever, back in the 60s and 70s when, COINTELPRO was happening, people very often used to wonder, is there an agent in our organization? Is there somebody working for the FBI or the local police? And sometimes there were, but the reality is that that suspicion did so much more damage than the presence of somebody actually might have. And this is what destroys organizations. And it also creates tremendous fear in the general population. So why? What's the point? Here, and I'm happy to talk about this some in the Q&A, we get into this question of the purpose of torture. And the pretext is always information, actionable intelligence. But the truth is, torture is actually a pretty bad way to get information. And I'm happy to talk more about that if people have questions about that. But it really does not produce actionable intelligence in a timely fashion that's going to be useful on a battlefield or in a war on terror. That's not what it's for. What torture does is it attacks social bodies at the level of the individual person. By taking apart the mental worlds of individuals, you destroy the bodies that might otherwise represent some kind of a threat to the political regime. Now, this is really obvious in places like Latin America, in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, in Greece, in the Philippines, in all the torture regimes that we know about. But what about US torture since 9/11? How does that fit this model? And I'm going to argue that there are two different audiences for what the theologian William Kavanaugh has called the striptease of power. This sort of now you see it, now you don't of torture. And so the first audience are literally those forces in Iraq or in Afghanistan that represented a direct military challenge to the US occupation. So for them, the audience for them, the message was, threaten the US occupation, threaten our personnel, threaten our presence in Iraq or in Afghanistan, and you will be tortured and your organization will be destroyed. So that's the usual purpose of torture. But what about those of us living in the United States? What about how torture affects us? And here I think it's a little different. I think that the fact that we were exposed to torture, the fact that we knew it was going on, I'm not saying that the Bush administration was thrilled when the pictures from Abu Ghraib were released, but in the end it wasn't problematic, and here's why. The logic goes like this. If our country, the United States, the leader of the free world, the champion of human rights globally, is forced to do such terrible things, think how terrible the people must be that we're doing it to. Think how dangerous they must be if we, the good guys, are forced to do this. Think how much danger you must be in if we have to do this to protect you. And so it becomes part of the whole theater of security that we've gotten so used to we hardly even think about it. We go to the airport, we take off our shoes, we take off our belts, we take off we put our liquids into a quart baggie, no bigger, no smaller. All of this is theater, in a way. And it reminds us over and over again that we need to be afraid. Yesterday, Jan and I were at the Ford dealer getting an oil change in our car because we've been driving around the country talking about the book, and they had CNN on. And they were preparing to hear President Obama's speech at the United Nations about how the United States wants to lead the international effort to destroy ISIL, the Islamic State in the Levant, or whatever you want to call it. And before the speech, it was fascinating to hear how the commentary was revving up a new global war on terror and was focusing on the possibility that there would be terror cells in the United States who would be going to enact terrible things here in our own country, in the homeland, as they call it. And this was not Fox News, this was CNN. But this whole ginning up of terror is starting up again, and I'm very concerned that with it we're going to see a renewed use of ways of compelling people to talk about something or other, even if it's not anything that's true. And so this is how it works for us. And I think in the process, people in this country have been offered a false bargain. And here's the bargain. You let us do what we need to, and we promise that you will be secure. And it's a false bargain because nobody can promise security. It's almost as if it's a promise of immortality. Let us torture some people over here and you will never die. But the reality, of course, is that everyone in this room is going to die. It's a fake bargain. But we have been led both by the fictional media and also by the news media to believe in this bargain. And what happens, what kind of a habit is that when you say, do whatever it takes to keep me safe, and I will accept that bargain? Well, some people call that concern for personal safety and survival again above everything else, cowardice. And so my working title for this book was actually A Nation of Cowards. But the publisher thought that was a little over the top. Oxford doesn't go in for the soundbite. But I actually think that it's true that as a nation, many of us have been encouraged to be more afraid, more cowardly. I think we've also been encouraged to be less just and also less capable of my personal favorite virtue, which is practical wisdom. It's what Aristotle called phronesis and Thomas Aquinas called prudence, which doesn't sound right in English. But basically what it is being able to use your intellectual skills to do good thinking about justice, about what is the right thing to do and what is the right way to go about doing it. So it's practical because it's about action, but it's intellectual because it's about using reason to understand. And I think insofar as we have been encouraged to misunderstand what torture is, to not understand how deeply embedded and institutionalized it is, we have been encouraged to close our eyes and to be less able to think. Hannah Arendt wrote about the people, the civil servants in Germany, that they were marked in some ways by this curious, she said they weren't stupid, but they couldn't think right. They couldn't think in a rational way. And I think this is, that we also in this country are at risk of having that happen to us. Okay, I'm not going to recount the whole history of US involvement in torture before and after September 11th. I'm just going to suffice it to say that the history is long, and that in the 20th century it includes a real ramping up in the post-World War II period as the US confronted the Soviet Union, and especially after the Korean War, when people, our soldiers, some of them were captured and tortured and also brainwashed, made to make false confessions that they seemed to actually believe. And the CIA wanted to understand how that was done. And there's a man named Alfred McCoy has written a wonderful history about that called A Question of Torture. He's a historian, it's an excellent book, but I won't go into that. But I do want to talk a little bit about what changed. Because before September 11th, we had a kind of a consensus in this country that whatever else we might do and whatever else might go on at the School of the Americas or whatever training we might provide for other organizations, other police forces, other militaries, we didn't do torture because torture was wrong. And, you know, we tried to believe that we also were teaching them that torture was wrong. An investigation of what we actually were doing revealed something different. But there was a consensus in the public that torture is wrong.
Let me just say that I was involved in a fight against the Office of Public Safety, which was involved in training the Latin American police.
Yes, yes.
And the Congress abolished, which was a program of USAID.
Right, right.
And the Congress abolished that, the Office of Public Safety, precisely because it was accused of teaching torture techniques.
And what do you think? Do you think that was true?
Yes.
I do too.
I mean,
Yeah. I was in El Salvador I worked in Nicaragua in the war zones for 6 months in 1984, and that's sort of the genesis of my interest in this issue, because I met people who had been tortured by the Contra. But in El Salvador, I was the interpreter for a delegation for 2 weeks, and we were meeting with trade unionists, and our main liaison was actually arrested while we were there. And we were able to visit him in his prison in it was called, I can't remember the exact. It wasn't in San Salvador, it was in San something Gotara. But anyway, we met with him, and he had been there for 3 days, and he described the ways that he had been tortured in those 3 days. And so, you know, and I knew that at that time, our government was directly funding and taking care of and training that government.
oh, the famous case of Dan Mitrione.
Oh, in Brazil.
And Uruguay, actually.
And Uruguay later on.
And, what's it called, state of siege?
Right.
One of the Costa Rica
Right.
things.
In Uruguay, it
But
was,
it's, yeah.
Yeah.
But, so, it has been official policy for the United States
Absolutely.
government, maybe not to torture at home,
but
but to
to
train.
train people all over the world, no question about it.
But for training is one thing, but to actually administer the torture is something quite different
Mhm.
for our.
Right. And so it was really obvious within a few days of September 11th that, to anyone who was looking, that one of the results of these attacks was that somebody was going to be tortured by the US. And as early as the first week of November, Newsweek published an op-ed by a historian, a respected historian named Jonathan Alter, who wrote, "In this autumn of our anger, even a liberal like me finds his thoughts turning to, ellipsis, torture." And he goes on to say that, well, maybe we shouldn't do it ourselves, or we should only do certain things, and we should send people to Saudi Arabia to be tortured, which is particularly ironic given that the majority of the people who actually were involved in 9/11 were Saudis, but whatever. He he recommended that we do several things that were direct violations of the UN Convention. And he was talking about the purpose of it, he said, was to jumpstart the investigation of the greatest crime in American history, by which he meant the attacks of September 11th. Some people might think maybe the greatest crime in American history was, I don't know, the genocide of the people who were living here, or the enslavement of millions of Africans, but whatever. It was a terrible crime, there's no question. But it's interesting that he wasn't even talking about using torture to prevent future attacks, but as part of a police investigation. And he said he was talking specifically about people the FBI had rounded up who weren't talking. So who were these people? Well, right after September 11th, around 600 people from the Middle East, most of them Muslims, were rounded up and held in the local jail in Brooklyn, New York. And this information was available in the New York Times. It was clear it was happening. And you could know about it. They were held, if it had happened in Latin America, we would have said they were disappeared. Incommunicado. They had no access to attorneys, no access to their families or friends. Nobody knew where they were. And they were supposedly involved in some way, or thought to possibly be involved in some way, with September 11th. They were tortured, some for 6 months, and in ways that became very familiar to us. Isolation, beatings, exposure to unremitting, endless loud noise, which many people who've been tortured say is the absolute worst of all the things that happen, because you cannot get away from it. And at least in one case, anal rape with a police flashlight, and exposure to extreme cold. All of this, as the New York Times said, within sight of the Statue of Liberty. All of these men were released eventually. Not one of them was ever charged with anything that had to do with terrorism. Many of them were here with green cards, some were here on expired visas. Those whose visas had expired were deported. None of them were charged with any crime that had anything to do with the attacks. So this was already starting. And in my own world, in the world of academic ethics, I found that the same thing was happening. People who 10 years before would have said torture is wrong were suddenly, or not so suddenly, coming up with scenarios, reasons why torture was now okay. And they were almost all of the form of the ticking time bomb problem. The problem that you have in front of you a terrorist you are absolutely 100% sure is going to set off a bomb in 2 hours. Only he has the information. Only by torturing can you get the information. And so the question is, do you torture him or not? These hypothetical questions are really the red herrings of the world of philosophy. As Gillian Anscombe said years ago, very often when somebody raises a hypothetical question like this, it's in order to get permission to do something that he knows is absolutely wrong. And so you construct the thing so that it's airtight. But in fact, it wouldn't work. First of all, you wouldn't know how to torture the person, because torture, like anything physical, is a skill that is learned, that is trained, and there are whole ways that people are actually trained in torture. Secondly, you wouldn't have the infrastructure. Thirdly, in a time-constrained situation like that, that is the one time that a person is most likely to be able to hold out, because they know if they can just hold out, the bomb will go off. And finally, this isn't how it happens. This has never happened. Torture is not about information. Torture is about breaking up organizations. And so, but we began to see this, and so I began to realize that this consensus had broken down. I want to turn now to a totally different subject, which is the subject that we were talking about at the beginning, which is torture in US prisons and jails. But I can't do that without talking a little bit about race. So, torture and race are actually tied together from the very beginning, in fact, before the beginning of the United States of America. And it begins with the ways that people who were living here before the Europeans were treated by the European settlers, but especially in the case of slavery. And as enslaved people from Africa were brought here, at the same time, methods of torture were developed and used without which they could not have gotten slaves to work. And I didn't understand exactly, I knew that torture was part of slavery, branding, whipping, mutilation, all kinds of terrible treatment, but I didn't understand that it was absolutely central to the functioning of slavery until I read a book by Edmund Morgan called American Freedom, American Slavery. It's about 35 years old now, but it's an excellent book. He looks at the state of Virginia, or the colony of Virginia, as a sort of test case. And what he looks at is how the labor developed on the farms the tobacco farms in Virginia. So the first people who were working on these farms were people from England who were poor. Many of them were people who had been displaced from the countryside and found themselves living in the cities, in London, who were picked up for vagrancy, for not having any money, or for being in debt, and were shipped over to work in Virginia, and with the promise that if they worked for 7 years, at the end of that time, they would get a chunk of land and be able to start their own farm. And many of them, in fact, did that. And sometimes if they ran away or something, they would get an extra few years tacked on to their term. But they knew that at the end of it, if they worked, they would actually be free and would get some land to work for themselves. So there was an incentive to work. When they brought the people from Africa, there was no promise that they were going to get 50 acres. There was no promise that they were ever going to be free, or even that their children or their grandchildren were going to be free. And what the people who were running the farms discovered was that the only way to make them work was to make their bodies hurt, was by torturing them. And so torture and African Americans in this country has a history that goes back to the very moment when they first arrived here. Then you come forward a little bit and you look at after the emancipation, there was a whole period after Reconstruction when into the 20th century, when African Americans living in the South were scooped up on the street, again, charged with very minor crimes or no crimes at all, and leased as convicts. So they were actually rented out to northern mining companies and manufacturing companies who set up factories and mines in the southern United States. And again, they were treated as if they were slaves, because in a sense, they really were still slaves. And this really helped to build the northern companies, the mining companies that we know today, through essentially forced slave labor. Then we come forward again to lynching, which again is an example of institutionalized state torture where the state participates and allows it to happen, and where the people are also involved. So in the southern United States, going to a lynching was actually a Saturday afternoon picnic activity. Whole families would come and take photographs of human beings being beaten and burned to death. And then these photographs, they would take to a local studio and have made into postcards, which were then sent around the country to their friends. Look at the fun that we had on Saturday afternoon. And there's a whole genre of these postcards, and people have collected them. And it's just a horrifying example. And the way that all of this is made possible is because every example of institutionalized state torture identifies one or more groups of people who are really not quite human. They don't quite fall into the category of human beings. So in Chile, they called the people they were torturing humanoid. In Brazil, they were actually scooped up on the street and tortured in front of police cadets by this guy, Dan Mitrione, as a way of training police cadets in torture. So they were like lab animals. In Greece, they were called vermin and rodents, but they're not quite human. And I think that if we look at mass incarceration in this country today, we'll see that the vast majority of people in our jails are people of color. And that's not an accident. They are certainly not the majority in this country, although in my beautiful state of California, we now have a white minority and a people of color majority. But people of color are vastly disproportionately represented in jails, especially young African American men. And once again, they are members of that torturable class. And the kinds of tortures that Katie was talking about, you did a great job of explaining what solitary confinement does. And we're beginning to understand that this is a form of torture that absolutely has to be stopped. And one of the signs of hope I really see in this country is that there's a momentum to end it, that, you know, NRCAT has very much been part of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. And I think that's really important. In my home state, California, we don't really know how many people are held in solitary, but it's a lot. And because of the indefinite sentencing laws, again, it's for indefinite periods of time. And last May, when people in Guantanamo were on hunger strike for indefinite detention and solitary confinement, they were using the only nonviolent method that they had to try to stop the torture that they, to this day, some of them are experiencing, was they were using a hunger strike. At the same time, 30,000 prisoners in California were on hunger strike, both demanding exactly the same thing, an end to indeterminate sentencing and solitary confinement, and in conscious solidarity with the people in Guantanamo. And both of them, both groups, were tortured in the same way, with the kind of, it's considered supposedly a medical intervention, but essentially it's forced feeding, and it's a form of torture. The person is strapped into a chair, a tube is shoved down that person's throat, and then Ensure is pumped into their stomachs. And it is, as one person who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times called Gitmo is Killing Me says, it was the worst pain I have ever experienced. I would not wish this kind of pain on anyone. You feel as though you have to vomit and you can't. And he said it was in the stomach and in the chest and the throat, and they're doing this to people twice a day. Obviously not as a humanitarian effort to make sure they eat. So I'd like to close like the speech portion of this with some personal words from the book, because I think it's really important that we have hope about fighting torture, because I really believe that we can. So, sometime during the early 1990s in San Francisco, California, I attended the speech of a Salvadoran trade unionist. Her name was Gloria. I had traveled to El Salvador myself in 1989 as the interpreter for a Solidarity delegation. At that time, the US-backed Salvadoran government had a strategy of kidnapping, torturing, and often murdering the middle-level leadership of trade unions, which they understood were a threat to their power. Gloria's purpose that evening in San Francisco was to inform her audience about the dangers in El Salvador to union members like herself. By way of illustration, she told the story of her own capture and torture by the notorious Salvadoran Treasury Police, the Policía Hacienda. She told us that it was only the pressure of phone calls and letters from La Solidaridad Internacional, International Solidarity, that had finally forced the police to set her free. As Gloria spoke, I began to shiver. I remembered that I had heard and spoken her name before. I realized that I myself had actually made some of those phone calls. This happened because my friend Sharon Martinez organized an informal phone tree among her Spanish-speaking friends. When news of police kidnappings reached her from El Salvador, she would provide the necessary information to telephone the appropriate police force or military force, because El Salvador had several, and to demand the victim's release. Sharon would keep us updated about what was known about the victim's whereabouts and supply us with the relevant phone numbers. That night, I remembered my phone calls to the Treasury Police, remembered insisting that we knew that they had Gloria, that she had been seen in the prison at Ilopango, which they controlled. Sharon's numbers were very good, and I remembered talking directly with the head of the prison there, insisting, despite his denials that they were holding Gloria, that she had been seen entering the prison and that she had to be set free immediately. As Gloria told her story, I was seized with a sort of retrospective horror. Suppose Sharon's little group had failed to make those calls. What if we had been too busy in the days of Gloria's capture to add our voice to those of others demanding her reappearance? What if no one in this country had sought to understand and counteract the practical implications of our own government's policies. But there was Gloria, alive and continuing her work. We had better get on with ours. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So that was a little longer than 15 minutes,
that
but
was fantastic.
are there questions?
Yes. So you spoke about how torture on the international stage.
Yeah. Mhm.
I don't know if you use this word, but it almost sounds like it's used in a preventative measure. Like, look what happened to him. Look what could happen to you. What reasons do you see behind domestic torture? Is it similar mindset? Is it more of a punishment? Is it a mix?
Really good question. I think a lot depends on who you're talking about, that who is the target of the torture. So for example, in US prisons, we have a kind of special kind of prison that's either called a supermax facility or a secure housing unit. And these shoes, as they're called, are places like what Katie was talking about, where you spend 24 hours a day in a white painted 8x10 cell with fluorescent lighting that never goes off, a video camera watching you the whole time, a hole in the floor to pee in, and your food is delivered, excuse me, on a tray that's shoved through a slot in the door. And so you have no human contact at all. And they say there are only 3 ways to get out of the shoe. You can either be paroled, which rarely happens. You can die, or you can debrief. And what debriefing means is to give up the names of other people who are members of the prison gang that you're part of. And so the idea is that the greatest threat inside prisons are gangs. And what's really interesting about these gangs, because they do exist, there's no question, is that they were actually created, they are a creation of prison policy, because prisons intentionally segregate the inmates by race and actually set them against each other. And it's out of this original segregation of prisons that the race-based gangs develop in the first place. So once you have these gangs, then there is an excuse and a reason to attack certain groups of people because they represent a threat to the authority of the people running the prison. And of course, that's a very genuine threat. It's a real threat of violence. And so one of the reasons that people are tortured inside prisons is the exact same reason. I think also, though, that to the extent that we're talking about focusing on communities of color, that the role of the police in those communities is never, it's not completely one thing. It's not only about public safety. There are many people who experience the police in their communities as more of an occupying army than a force that keeps them safe. And this is becoming more and more true as we see this revolving door both between military personnel and prison guards, prison correction officers, and also local law enforcement. But now we're seeing this tremendous militarization of law enforcement itself. So in Fort Ferguson, for example, where Michael Brown was killed, we saw the police dressed in full military combat gear. And police departments all over the country, including, by the way, university police departments, are receiving tremendous amounts of M16 rifles, military vehicles, armored patrol cars, night vision goggles. I'm sorry, but my university police, I do not feel more secure knowing that they have M16 rifles, honestly. And this is the kind of militarization that we're seeing. And so for communities, poor communities, communities of color, I do think that the kind of power to cause physical pain and harm that the police and then the prisons have actually does serve as a warning to those communities not to create a threat to the established powers. I want to also say that another form of torture in prison that is so common we think nothing of it is rape. And when I say we think nothing of it, think about the last time you watched Law and Order SVU. And you can see it anytime, day or night. You can turn on your television and see a rerun of Law and Order SVU or some other police procedural. And so here's the plot. It's the same all the time. Somebody has done something terrible. The police have arrested this person who is absolutely 100% guilty. How do you know that? Well, not because you had a trial or anything, but you just know. They're the guilty person. They put them in a room, and the first goal is to prevent them from lawyering up, because the last thing you want a perp to do is exercise their actual constitutional rights and ask for a lawyer. Instead, you want the opportunity to fool them into making a confession. So what do? You threaten them. You say, you know, you could ask for a lawyer, but it would be much better if you cooperated with us, because we're going to have to send you to Rikers before the lawyer comes. And you know, a pretty boy like you know what's going to happen to you at Rikers. And so the idea that people get raped in prison is almost a joke on television. But in fact, Amnesty International has done a series of reports about rape in prison, and it is so common that it is almost a part of a person's sentence. Male prisoners are mostly raped by other prisoners, but often with the connivance and at the direction of the corrections officials. Female prisoners who are raped are usually the victims of corrections staff. So this is another example of how, in this huge incarceration problem we have in this country today, people are being tortured on a daily basis, really right out in public. So I don't know if you have anything you'd like to add, thoughts or questions. You know, people often ask, what can I do, right? And I don't want people to feel hopeless. The fact is there's a lot you can do. You can support an organization like the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, which does tremendous work with faith communities. And if you don't have time to do things directly, you can certainly give them money. And you'll find how to donate on their website. There are other organizations that are doing really important work. School of America's Watch, which every year in November holds a big series of demonstrations and workshops and conferences at Fort Benning, Georgia. They can also use your body, your presence, your money. Witness Against Torture is another important organization, and the United States Human Rights Committee is another one who are producing a series of shadow reports to send to the United Nations. Every 5 years, every country that signed the UN Convention Against Torture is supposed to send a report on how well they're doing. So the US is sending our report on how well we're doing to Geneva, and at the same time, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, are allowed to send sort of shadow reports. So we're sending one in particular that is a demand that people who are responsible for torture in the US at the highest level actually be prosecuted. Because I think until we have a full accounting of everything that the United States has done and is doing, and the report we were talking about at the beginning, the Senate Intelligence Committee report on the CIA, is part of that. We need a full accounting, and that's only the beginning, because there are many other agencies that are involved in interrogation besides the CIA. For example, the Joint Special Operations Command, which is now very active in Africa, and which was active in Iraq and had their own torture camp called Camp Nama, and their own slogan that was up on posters all over the walls that said, "No blood, no foul." In other words, as long as the victim doesn't bleed, you can do whatever you want. So, as I was saying, we need a full accounting of everything that the US has done. And there needs to be accountability. People who are responsible at the highest levels need to be held legally responsible for what's been done and what is continuing to be done. We know that When that doesn't happen, when there is impunity, when people are not punished or not charged for the things that they have done, torture regimes can continue. Not forever. You know, the generals are gone in Brazil, they're gone in Argentina, they're gone in Chile, they're gone in Uruguay, but it does continue for a long time. And sometimes justice takes a long time. Just now, the generals are being charged in Argentina. Just now, they are actually bringing to trial in Chile the people responsible for the murder of Salvador Allende, who was defeated by a coup. Actually, what I used to think of when I thought of September 11th was September 11th, 1973, the day that Pinochet overthrew the elected government in El Salvador with the connivance of the US White House. So anyway, as Martin Luther King said, the arc of the universe is very long, but it bends towards justice, and I believe that there will be justice for the victims of torture at the hands of the US eventually. The sooner the better. So we were doing Q&A,
Good.
and
I was in Chile on September the 11th.
you were there, so was a friend of mine.
73.
Were you really? What were you doing there?
I was working with the Methodist Church,
Uh-huh.
and that's what got me involved in international human rights issues.
We have a very good friend
Yeah.
whose father, who was there, she was 12 years old. Her father was a pediatrician working with the American Friends Service Committee.
Warner.
And
Warner.
yeah, Al Warner. And
Working with the FSC.
AFSC, he, as a pediatrician in Chile, I think in some of the poorer communities of Santiago. So wow, you were there, and how long did you stay afterwards?
I arrived coincidentally with the election of Allende,
Right.
and lived there for 3 years, and
Wow.
then went through the coup.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
And then have you ever heard of WOLA, Washington Office?
Oh, on Latin America, of course.
Yeah, well, I
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
there on
Right. Larry Burns was there, right?
Larry Burns is the council administrator.
Oh, right, other one, sorry.
Larry Burns
But
and I
yeah,
were working, I mean.
wow. So
We
we,
didn't, yeah.
I learned a lot about WOLO when I was doing Nicaragua work, Central America Solidarity in the 80s. And I'm sure I heard you on KPFA all the time. We used to hear, you know, the folks from WOLA, and you were a founder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so important work. I mean, and you know, I used to say that Latin America does really well whenever the US has its attention somewhere else. And I think the last few years have actually been good for Latin America, you know, but yes.
The only country in Central America that is doing well in terms of citizen security is Nicaragua.
Interesting.
Which is the only country with which the United States has virtually no
relation.
programs.
Right, exactly. Yeah, they're about to build a huge canal if it
Yeah,
really
which
goes
is-
through, which is really not the world's greatest idea in my humble opinion,
I
but
think it's a catastrophe waiting to happen.
absolutely. But yeah, I
So you
wish
were in Nicaragua,
I was there with Witness
80
for Peace
84.
in '84. So I spent 6 months in the war zones. And so have you been there? Yeah, so I was up in Jinotega, in Nueva Segovia, and then in Tasbapri on the Atlantic coast, and I spent a bunch of time in Las Minas, so Ciuna, Rosita, Bonanza, and the work pretty much was generally, in those days the Boland Amendment was still in effect, which outlawed direct aid to the Contra, so part of what we were doing was looking for evidence that that aid was actually happening, which we found. One of my co-workers, Peter Olson, actually after the attack in June on Ocotal, which is up in the north in Nueva Segovia, found these brochures that the Contra had left that were produced by the CIA that had information on how to do assassinations, how to do sabotage on phone lines, how to do, various things that would, because the targets for the Contra War were any of the services that the government was providing, so school teachers and health clinics and phone lines and electric lines were special targets. So, yeah, so I would be, you know, going from town to town and interviewing the folks who had survived the attacks, and sometimes occasionally being there during an attack, although never close enough to be in personal danger, but enough to be good and scared,
Yeah,
enough to learn where the expression "scared shitless" comes from.
right.
But yeah, and it was an amazing time
That
to
was.
be there. You know, when people were just learning to read, people were the best of the Sandinista party were the lower level folks who went out into the campo, and a lot of them died. You know, and you know, it was certainly not perfect, but there was a genuine effort to create something
Right.
different, with a mixed economy, with you know, a real sense of
Community.
community.
Well, it's community policing.
right.
I mean, why they're in Honduras has the highest murder rate in the world.
Mhm.
It's negligible for neighboring Nicaragua,
Nicaragua.
which has the same socioeconomic conditions.
Absolutely. And no, when I think about what's happening in Honduras now, I have a very good friend who had to leave there in the 80s and has been in Mexico for the last 30 years. But she's from San Pedro Sula, yeah. And she says that it is worse now than it was in the 80s.
Wow.
That the interpenetration of the narco traffickers and the military is just terrible. And Mexico is pretty bad too, unfortunately. She doesn't drive at night anymore, and because it's just not safe to have your car on the highway between the DF and Cuernavaca, where she lives. It's a 45-minute drive, and she won't do it at night. But and interestingly, Mexico has also seen a huge increase in state torture in the last few years, as you probably know. So.
Well, listen, we can stop, you can stop the filming and we'll just have a conversation.
Yeah,
I mean,
that
we'll
sounds
just-
great. So.